Day the UN declared the Nakba a catastrophe.
Oh, I haven't. Wednesdays, I never get to see the news until like after dinner, so I haven't caught up with it yet. What do you mean precisely they did?
All right, let me look at it again.
Here we are, and YouTube goes over to that monitor. And good. Okay, don't worry about it. I can take a look at it afterwards. I'll just pull up the site later on. Although one tidbit I did see during lunchtime was that they admitted that there was a tunnel under one of the schools in Gaza, which they were properly condemnatory of, but would be nice if they admitted and policed those things in an earlier, more timely fashion. All right, but we are not here to discuss the situation in Israel. We are here to study Mishnah. And in particular, we are talking about something that is very much halacha l'ma'aseh, that is practical, living, still very much used halacha that everybody should know about. And that is called Eruv Tavshilin. Those of you that have been studying with me for a while will remember when we talked about Eruv before, but that Eruv was in particular the Eruv for carrying between domains, or the Eruv for extending the Tehum, the boundary of walking around your residence. This Eruv is also related to Shabbat, but it is a cooking Eruv. And we're going to go through the Mishnah first, and then I'm going to show you how this actually works out a little bit in practice. It's relatively short, but I do want you to be a little bit more familiar with it than you might already be. All right, so chapter 2, Mishnah number 1, we are dealing with a very particular time period. Yom Tov, which fell on the eve of Shabbat, one should not begin to cook on Yom Tov for Shabbat. It's not unusual to get a little bit thrown off by the term Erev Shabbat, eve of Shabbat. We tend to think of Erev Shabbat as meaning Shabbat evening. You know, that's what it sounds like it means in English. But it can also mean the day before Shabbat, the entirety of the day before Shabbat. So if Shabbat is obviously starting Friday night, this would be a chag, a festival that begins on a Thursday night and continues through Friday and will finish at the time that Shabbat commences. So that's the time period that we're dealing with. Now, what's the issue? Well, as we've been saying throughout this Masechet, you are allowed to cook on the Chag, on Yom Tov, for Yom Tov. If you want to have scrambled eggs for breakfast on Pesach, morning, the first day of Yom Tov, that's okay. We've talked about a number of the limitations, but it's okay. Generally speaking, you are allowed to cook on the day of Yom Tov for the day itself. Like we've seen, there's some caveats with regards to things that could have been prepared in advance, but for the moment, we'll just leave it as the generic. You can cook on Yom Tov for Yom Tov. Well, that seems to strongly imply that you cannot cook on Yom Tov for Shabbat. Why is that an issue? Well, because what are you going to eat on Shabbat then? In the ancient world, as Dr. Kolp points out, it's not easy to just put something in the refrigerator and then pull it out and warm it up. That wasn't a convenient option, and many types of food would spoil if just left out during the day between Thursday afternoon, which would have still been a weekday, until Friday night for Erev Shabbat, literal evening of Shabbat, to say nothing about what will be done for the day of Shabbat, Saturday, and what about my food for that? Of course, one solution would simply be eat cold food for Shabbat if the day before Shabbat happens to be Yom Tov. That is a perfectly valid solution, and under less than ideal circumstances, that is absolutely fine. However, generally speaking, Judaism has leaned towards the idea that a celebration should have cooked dishes. that we are not animals. We don't eat our food raw, and that the cooking of a food enhances its ability to be enjoyed. It also enhances its ability to be digested, which is probably not a coincidence. And indeed, fire and the cooking of food is one of the earliest symbols of humanity, even before we became Homo sapiens. So they are going to now struggle with this question. How do we celebrate Shabbat if we can't cook on Yom Tov? Since if we don't cook on the day leading into Shabbat, we're not going to have anything that's properly prepared. Yes, Aaron?
Just out of curiosity, they put this big emphasis on cooking meat, and that's why it's allowed on Yom Tov, but isn't that inconsistent with Shabbat, which is also supposed to be a celebratory day, but they do not allow cooking?
Well, that's because it's not they allowing cooking or they not allowing cooking. It's the Torah allows cooking, and it does so expressly for Yom Tov, and it does not give that permission for Shabbat. So, yes, we can marvel that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave permission to cook on Yom Tov, which definitely enhances our celebration, but did not give us permission to cook on Shabbat, which we might consider to be deleterious to our celebration. But on the one hand, it is true that that could be an issue. On the other, it's also true that if one prepares the day before Shabbat, Friday usually, it would be fine to be able to eat on Shabbat for cooked meals and warmed meals as well. They had no problem warming up food within certain limitations, as we can see in Masechet Shabbat, on Shabbat itself. The issue here is about how do you actually prepare the food and keep it from spoiling. And even up until the 20th century, most people were cooking for the day, and leftovers were not really a thing. You ate the food you cooked because it probably wasn't going to be good tomorrow. So this really only becomes an acute problem on this juxtaposition. But yes, the reason why there's a difference between cooking on Yom Tov and not cooking on Shabbat is not rabbinic choice. That is simply what the Torah itself explicitly writes.
But that's just the Hakim answer, though, right?
The what?
Statutory answer.
Well, so you mean, okay, so I guess I got confused by your usage of the pronoun they. So yes, it is a chok, you can say, that the Torah didn't give us permission to cook on Shabbat. If I were going to try to explain why the Torah might not have given us permission to cook on Shabbat, I would point out that if one were allowed to cook on Shabbat, that Shabbat would lose much of its special flavor. That the beauty of Shabbat being completely isolated from all forms of work, especially cooking, which is often one of the most labor-intensive activities that our ancestors engaged in, and still to this day is a bit more of an ordeal than many people like to admit, if you're not just eating takeout all the time. But that really does preserve Shabbat. And with Shabbat coming once a week, if we were to allow cooking on Shabbat, then it would make it very hard for Shabbat to truly rise to that position. On the other hand, for Yom Tov itself, not only have we been given permission, but since Yom Tov is so rare, again, in the biblical time, only one day for each of the holidays, not the two that we enjoy now, it would not have diminished or contaminated the spirit of the festival the same way. Plus, it would allow for some special celebrations that might not be otherwise possible. And that allows for a slight distinctiveness for Yom Tov compared to Shabbat. And it is important to be able to have that different flavor between Shabbat and Yom Tov. Okay, but let's get back to the matter at hand. But he may cook for Yom Tov, and if any is left over, it is left over for Shabbat. So that's perfectly fine. If you are cooking on Friday for Sukkot, the actual first day of the Chag, and you make a brisket, and you have that wonderful brisket, and there's still leftovers. Well, of course, you can eat the leftovers on Shabbat. Cooking for Yom Tov does not have to be perfectly exclusionary. As long as you are eating it on Yom Tov, leftovers are perfectly fine for Shabbat as well. As Dr. Kolb points out, this means one could even cook an extra large portion and that would be perfectly fine as long as what you were cooking was also meant for consumption on Yom Tov. But wait, there's more. And he may prepare a dish on the eve of Yom Tov. Again, eve here means the day before. In our scenario, that means Thursday, and rely upon it to prepare food for Shabbat. All right, this is the part that's going to perhaps blow your mind if you're not used to Erev Tavshilin already. If you cook something on Thursday and you set it as being a bookmark, a placeholder, a symbol of your preparations for Shabbat, then you may cook completely different things on Yom Tov that will be then served for Shabbat. And what does that cooking on Thursday look like? Well, there's a little bit of a disagreement. Beit Shammai says 2 dishes, meaning 2 different food items to be prepared. But Beit Hillel says 1 dish. Yet they both agree that a fish and an egg upon it are considered as 2 dishes. Even if they are kind of mixed, they're still considered 2. But Beit Hillel agrees that or holds that even still, you only really need 1 dish. So if you boil an egg on Thursday, or more likely boil multiple eggs, and you are beginning that preparation with a formal declaration of Erev Tavshilin, which we will look at, then you can continue to prepare on Yom Tov for Shabbat, cooking on Yom Tov for Shabbat, because you are continuing the process of preparing for Shabbat. You are not initiating it. Now, that may seem a little bit like rabbinic fiat, but again, like we've talked about with other issues of Eruvin, what we are seeing here is the rabbinic excuse me, it's been a long day. We are seeing here the rabbinic leniency being granted to a place where the rabbinic stringency was created. The Torah itself doesn't say explicitly in and of itself on a cursory reading that you can only cook on Yom Tov for Yom Tov. The rabbis understand it to mean that, and they take it to mean a very limited form of permission to cook. But technically, the Torah itself is not necessarily prohibiting this. The rabbis believe that it is, but that means the rabbis are now also in a position to believe that there is a leniency available through the formulation of an eruv, that the rabbis took away the right to cook in some manner, in a way of looking at it, and now they are giving back the right to cook when one goes through the proper consideration. Now, is that a loophole that they are creating to a stringency that they made? You could put it that way if you wanted to be derogatory towards what they are doing. Is this the rabbis trying to protect both Yom Tov and Shabbat, but also accommodating the needs of the community, and doing so in a way that the community will not only be able to feed itself in joy and comfort, but will also be mindful of both Yom Tov and Shabbat in a way that is preemptory, that they are thinking in advance of their behavior rather than just saying, oh, I forgot, oh, well, I'll do it anyway. But no, actually creating room by having that intentionality be stretched over now the course of 3 days. Yeah, absolutely, you betcha. That, in my opinion, and I promise not to do too much sermons on this tonight, that, in my opinion, is the beauty of Erev Tavshilin or any of the other rabbinic enactments that are similar, where the rabbis are showing that they are trying to protect the spirit of the mitzvot while also recognizing the needs of the community, and doing so in a way that leaves us with a heightened appreciation of the commandments, but doesn't diminish our ability to enjoy these days and to do so as a community. Let me just read off part 6 and finish off this Mishnah before we do our digression. If he ate it or it was lost, meaning the food that he prepared on Thursday, he may not begin to cook, relying on it. Meaning he can't say, oh, well, I started. It's got to still be around. But if he left over any small portion of it, he may rely on it to cook for Shabbat. So it's not a complete fiction. There does need to be some tangible remnant of that Thursday cooking that you began in honor of Shabbat, so that you can still cook on Friday, Yom Tov, for Shabbat. But as long as there's something, then you can rely upon it to make your preparations. Questions or comments before we do our digression?
So you can cook, as you say, an egg on
right?
Thursday that your kavana is for Shabbat. You live there, and after and you do anything else, and on Shabbat you say, "Oh, I want to continue preparing the meal," and you can cook everything on Shabbat.
Not on Shabbat, on Yom Tov, on Friday. So we have weekday Thursday, Yom
Yes.
Tov, like let's say Sukkot, first day, Friday, and then Shabbat on Shabbat, on Saturday.
Yeah.
So you make the eruv with the egg on a Thursday, then
Yeah.
Thursday night you begin Sukkot. Friday day, you start cooking for Shabbat. Without that preparatory cooking on Thursday, you wouldn't be allowed to cook for Shabbat on
Got it.
Sukkot. Does that timeline make more sense?
Yes.
Okay, got it. Aaron?
So, Rabbi, the food has to be inside an eruv?
No. This is the term eruv here just means mixing. Just like we used the term eruv when we talked about the districts in moving around. It doesn't mean it has to be in an official eruv.
And the food has to be set aside, you said, on third? You can set aside it on day 2 of Yom Tov too, right?
No. It has to be set aside before Yom Tov begins. So if Yom Tov begins Thursday night and continues on Friday, then this process has to begin on Thursday, at least before nightfall, before Yom Tov begins. All right. Now, I knew there would be lots of questions, which is why I went ahead and took the liberty of loading up Mishnah Torah, chapter 6, which goes through the details of how to establish an eruv, at least according to Rambam. There are a few arguments. There is, on some points a machloket, but his general description is fairly normative for most communities. Now, I'm not going to go through and read all of it out loud because I think all of you are capable of reading by yourself. But if you are looking for it, it is Mishnah Torah, Rest on Holiday, how appropriate, and it's chapter 6. And basically, this is the general description. As you can see, Rambam, one of his beautiful elements is that he synthesizes not only the Mishnah, but also the Talmud. And he does so in a way that is more methodical than the Mishnah to our modern ears. Remember, the Mishnah wasn't written to be learned from. The Mishnah was written to be remembered about. And that means it was written in a style that is more about what would jar your memory or jog your memory, rather than what would get you from 0 to 100% understanding. Rambam tries to go from 0 to 100 for topics. So as you can see, here we are. When a holiday falls on a Friday or on the holiday that precedes the Shabbat, we may not bake or cook the food that will be eaten on Shabbat. As we saw, this prohibition is rabbinic in origin, so that one will not prepare food on a holiday for a subsequent weekday. For a person will make the deduction, since he is not allowed to cook for Shabbat, surely he may not cook for a weekday. Therefore, dun dun dun, a person who prepares a portion of food on the day prior to the holiday, Thursday, and relies on it, has that as the intentionality, is permitted to cook and bake for Shabbat on the holiday. Only on the holiday, you can never cook on Shabbat. The portion of food on which he relies is referred to as Erev Tavshilin. So again, it's beautiful the way he just starts out building up the basic concepts. And when you go along, he gives a little more explanation of why we call it an Eruv. He goes on to talk about exactly how big the food has to be, what is the portion size. These are all things that are discussed in the Talmud in much more detail. And he talks about what actually counts as being cooked food, how does it have to be prepared, and things like that. And the idea that it has to be accessible, it can't disappear because it's eaten, lost, or destroyed. All the things that you probably could infer, but of course, these are much longer discussions. What I do want to come down to is where he talks about a concept that may seem very unusual. When a person sets aside an Erev Tavshilin so that he and others may rely on it, he must grant others a portion as one grants them a portion with regard to the Eruvin employed on Shabbat. So you have to actually say, I'm setting aside this food and it's for me and others to be able to cook on Yom Tov for Shabbat. And technically that means others are allowed to use that food, but more importantly, they are allowed to rely upon that food. Whoever is allowed to acquire a portion with regard to the Eruvin of Shabbat may acquire a portion with regard to the Eruv Tavshilin. Conversely, whoever is not allowed with regard to those Eruvin cannot for this. It is not necessary to notify the others whom one grants a portion in the Eruv before the commencement of the holiday. You don't have to go around and tell everyone, don't worry, guys, I'm cooking the egg for all of us. You can give that information later. However, they, meaning the other people relying upon your egg, must know that someone has granted them a portion and established an Eruv before they rely on it for cooking and baking. Even if they did not receive notification until the holiday itself, they are permitted to rely on it. A person may establish an Eruv on behalf of all the inhabitants of a city and all those within its holiday limits. On the following day, he may announce, whoever did not establish an Eruv Tavshilin may rely on my Eruv. And then we talk about the blessing, but we're going to look at that in an actual Siddur. But the idea here is that you are allowed to establish an Eruv, and it can be for one, it can be for a million, as long as they are within the same boundary of your community. And that means that technically, one does not need to do this Eruv for oneself if you are part of a community where you know that the Eruv is being performed on your behalf. So, for example, in most congregations, the people will rely on the fact that the rabbi, like me, will be doing an Eruv if it is a Thursday preparation for a Yom Tov on Friday, for a Shabbat follow-up, and to know that that's being done on their behalf. And in most Siddurim, if you're not sure, or if you're on your own or not part of a community, you will find the brachot to recite for doing the Eruv on your own. And if you wish to do an Eruv on your own, even if you are part of a community, just as a way of stretching that kavanah, that intentionality of celebrating the holiday and celebrating Shabbat and embracing this rabbinic principle, then by all means you can do your own blessing and prepare the Eruv Tavshilin on your own. Like I said, most good Siddurim will have the brachot in it, but it is very straightforward, which is
just you need one person in the community that they did for the rest, and that's it.
That's it. Exactly right. So this is just like for the Eruv for carrying between the community, that this would also cover everybody who was in the area. And the blessing is the standard mitzvah blessing. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidishanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al mitzvat Eruv. Very straightforward. It's one of those al mitzvat with just the appendix of the particular topic, and then you are ready. And it goes on to just explain so that we don't forget. By means of this Eruv, it will be permissible for us to bake, cook, keep dishes warm, to kindle a light from an existing flame. We can transfer fire on Shabbat, but we cannot kindle new fire, and to prepare and do all our necessities on the festival for the needs of Shabbat, for us and for all Jews who live in the city.
And I see the bracha, sorry.
Go ahead.
Can I see the bracha?
Oh, yeah.
Again.
Right here.
Mitzvah Eruv, very plain.
Yeah,
but this mitzvah Eruv is the same bracha for building an Eruv, or just for the food of Eruv?
It's the same formulation, but it's not. But this is for the actual food Eruv, the tavshilin, the cooking.
But how do you know? Because it didn't say that. Say mitzvah Eruv. What about if you use the same bracha for the Eruv, the physical Eruv, not the meal?
Well, that's where we get the second paragraph, because just like you're probably familiar with like Bedikat Chametz or Biur Chametz, there's an additional declaration that goes along with it, right? By means of this Eruv, right? You are making a clarification of exactly what this Eruv is for. And you're also reminding yourself of the limits. I can bake and cook and keep dishes warm. I can kindle a fire from an existing flame. I can prepare and do the necessities for the Shabbat, for Shabbat on the festival, for me, for all the Jews who live in the city, right? That is the formal declaration. And that makes it very clear that you're not allowed to go out and do things that are not permitted on Yom Tov, for example. It also settles an argument about whether or not you can bake or only cook, or whether you can cook, but or whether you can bake but not cook, and things like that, which is another discussion. But the answer is yes, you can bake, cook, and do these other things as well. All right, so that's just a little taste of how the Mishnah gets applied to this day for that situation. And I can tell you that we end up with it's more common here in the diaspora outside Israel, because we have 2 days of Chag, and so because of the way they line up, it's more common in the diaspora to get the need for doing an Eruv Tav Shilin, because very often in the diaspora we have either 2 days, Thursday, Friday, and then Saturday, and so we need to make the Eruv on Wednesday night, or we have a 2-day Chag that goes on Friday and Saturday that overlaps Shabbat on one day, and we'll need to do it on Thursday as normal. So it's very common. If you, on the other hand, live in Israel and you have a holiday that for us starts on Thursday and continues on Friday, in Israel it'll stop on Friday, giving you that day to prepare for Shabbat without it being Chag. So this is more relevant in the diaspora than even in Israel. It's one of those few mitzvot we get to do more than our Israeli brother and sisters. Okay. Mishnah 2, continuing from chapter 2, and we are moving back to other things that are questionable of whether they can be done on Yom Tov when Shabbat comes right after it. But we're moving out of the cooking topic. If Yom Tov fell on the day after Shabbat, meaning we now have the roles reversed, so it's Shabbat and then Yom Rishon, also known as Sunday, is the day of the festival. If Yom Tov fell on the day after Shabbat, Beit Shammai says one must immerse everything which is ritually impure, unclean, before Shabbat. So if you need to immerse in preparation for Yom Tov, or you need to immerse an item in preparation for Yom Tov, then it needs to be done before Shabbat, because you can't do it on Shabbat. Now, why would we be doing this? Well, one, many people would go to the mikveh prior to Yom Tov for themselves, just as a preparation for Yom Tov. But especially when it's before Pesach, when there is an obligation to eat the Seder sacrifice in a state of ritual purity, then this is not just a spiritual activity, this is a halakhic requirement. So making sure that you or anything else that is needed for the meal is ritually pure is of absolute essence. That is why, of course, we have a makeup Pesach in the biblical and ancient times. But as we have seen before, Beit Hillel disagrees. But Beit Hillel says vessels must be immersed before Shabbat. They agree on that point, but people may immerse on Shabbat. So because the immersion of a vessel seems to be a parallel to transforming the vessel from being incomplete to being complete, as being a final step in rendering it usable, that, of course, is one of the melachot that we cannot perform on Shabbat. So Beit Hillel agrees you shouldn't be dunking your vessels on Shabbat. Do them the day before Shabbat. Do them on, in this case, Friday day. But people in fine are allowed to go into a mikveh on Shabbat, and even though that is technically preparing for Yom Tov on Shabbat, the actual immersion itself is not prohibited, and thus it is allowed to go to the mikveh on Shabbat in preparation for the Yom Tov that will begin immediately after. Make sense? All right, not hearing any arguments, so let's continue. Mishnah 3.
But doing that, are you not preparing yourself for Yom Tov on Shabbat? It's like food, going to the mikvah, on Shabbat with your mind and your kavanah to Yom Tov. It's like doing an action on Shabbat for and day that is less holy than Shabbat.
So yes, that's of course why Beit Shammai disagrees. Beit Shammai holds that we shouldn't do anything on Shabbat at all unless it is absolutely permitted and needed for Shabbat and only for Shabbat.
Because you always go up in holiness, you don't go down in holiness.
That is absolutely true, but it is also true that it's not in and of itself prohibited to be immersed on Shabbat. That going to the mikveh on Shabbat may not be required for Shabbat, but it's also not prohibited in and of itself. And while we generally avoid doing things on Shabbat that are for the next day, if it is something that still also gives us the benefit of having been rendered ritually pure on Shabbat, then we're not enjoying the benefit. We are enjoying the benefit of immersion on Shabbat itself, even if its primary purpose was for the next day. I got caught up in my double negatives there. But you're right, there is logic to say no, which is why Beit Shammai has their own opinion. However, they do agree. Remember, they agreed on more things than they disagreed. We only have a record of their arguments, but they did also agree on some things. And most of them were agreed upon. And this second part and Mishnah 2:3 is giving us something they agreed upon. They agree that one may affect surface contact for unclean water in a stone vessel in order to purify it, but one may not immerse it. All right, so this is a little finicky. You, first of all, have to remember that a stone vessel cannot become ritually impure. That is one of the beautiful things of stone implements. They cannot contract ritual impurity according to Jewish law. That's why if you have a nice granite countertop, you're in great shape. And it's also why when they go back and look at the archaeology of the Second Temple period, they find many utensils near the temple that were made from stone rather than clay, because they were thus not susceptible to impurity. But water can become impure. So what happens if I have water that became impure? For example, it was in the room when someone died, and now it's become ritually impure, but I need the water. Maybe the water is very short of supply. I'm not sure what it might be, but I need the water. Well, technically, what you can do is take the water in a stone vessel, take that vessel and lower it into the mikvah just until the top of the vessel hits the edge of the mikvah water, so that a little of the mikvah water touches the water inside the vessel, and then the water is now ritually pure. Now, why is that allowed with a stone vessel? Because it is clear that it is not the stone vessel that is being purified, because stone vessels can't be purified because they can't be impurified. So the stone vessel removes any doubt or suspicion of what you're doing at the mikvah, and it is okay to purify the water in the vessel on Shabbat by itself.
And also we say that you cannot purify vessels also on Yom Tov and Shabbat.
Exactly. And that's why
that's why yes. Okay.
And that's why it's a stone vessel, because I'm not purifying it, because it could never need purification. So yes, it's a little bit of a beautiful thinking. And this is something that both Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai agree upon. Even though they both agreed that you could not immerse vessels in general to purify them, they do agree that a stone vessel can be lowered into the mikveh just to that top as a way of purifying the water inside the stone vessel. And one may immerse to change from one intention to another, or from one company to another. So the idea here is something that was discussed just a minute ago that Natan mentioned about something that could be used for a holier purpose. So if you have a purified vessel that is intended to be used for holy rank 2, but you now want to use it for holy rank 1, then you need to immerse it, and that is okay. To immerse it in order to move it to that other level, or to go from being mundane and move it up, that is allowed. With regards to the company, this idea is that there were you would agree to be part of a certain group for eating certain things. In this case, for example, truma, where you are eating something that is not only ritually pure, but the people eating it have to be ritually pure. And if you are going to eat with a different group in order to be able to eat that truma, then you have to immerse in order to be ritually pure for that other purpose. All right, and I think we can definitely get 2-4 done, which is, again, making some distinctions of what can be done on Yom Tov. Here we're not talking about Yom Tov versus Shabbat, we're just talking about Yom Tov itself. Beit Shammai says, one may bring peace offerings on Yom Tov, but may not lay hands upon them. But one may not bring burnt offerings on Yom Tov at all. So you can bring up the offering to be prepared for an offering, but you can't lay hands upon it. Now, why are we not laying hands upon it? Well, the laying of hands was, of course, part of the sacrificial code. You can see the citation there for Leviticus 3. And that was considered to be a use of the animal, because when you put your hands on the animal, there is a strain, a pressure. You are leaning on the animal. It's not just like hovering. There's effort involved, and that means you are causing the animal effort as well. And we're not allowed to use our animals on Yom Tov, which we will see more of. So for Beit Shammai, you can bring it, but you can't push it. And for a burnt offering, well, since the burnt offering won't be eaten at all, then you definitely can't bring it and let alone put your hands upon it, because you're not allowed to do such a thing on Yom Tov if it's not involving food. Since a peace offering couldn't at least theoretically be eaten, the bringing is fine, but the laying on is not. Beit Hillel is going to disagree. Let me just get it down here. Beit Hillel says, one may bring peace offerings and burnt offerings and also lay hands upon them. All right, so we're seeing a consistency of the leniency from Beit Hillel that we've had throughout really this entire Masechet, which is if something is allowed a little bit, in general, it'll be allowed for other things as well. So even though the burnt offerings are not going to be eaten, if we are allowing this process of handling and preparing of the animals at all, then yes, we are allowing this to happen as well. This is still part of the festival. It is still part of the commandments. We still have blanket permission. The same way as we're going to see in other places, you are allowed to prepare hot water or to prepare other things, say Beit Hillel, for the festival, even if it's not technically cooking. So too in this case, you can do these things as well. Questions or comments, or we can run on to 2.5 and talk a little bit about our feet. Okay. Beit Shammai says, a man may not heat water for his feet unless it is also fit for drinking. So again, heating water is a form of cooking. That's pretty much the only way you can cook water is to boil it. And Beit Shammai says, well, if you want to heat water for your feet, meaning to wash your feet and, have them be comfortable and all of that, okay, but it better be a form of cooking, meaning that the water you're using has to also be food. It has to be drinking water. And then, yes, you can use it to wash your feet, but it has to at least be drinkable. But Beit Hillel permits it. Again,
So
Beit Hillel
drinkable doesn't mean that you need to drink it after that. Just the level drinkable that is clean, that's it.
Well, there's actually an interesting discussion in the Talmud that says, actually, they meant you can do that, but you have to drink a little bit of it first. So take a
before
sip.
the feet. Okay.
Right. Yeah, before
Okay.
the feet. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, before the feet. Before the
Okay.
feet. So there are some opinions that were arguing that. I should point out, like in most cases, Beit Hillel is winning this argument for halacha l'maaseh. So indeed, as a modern debate, there are many people that will, especially with a electric water heater, say there's no problem, heating up water for taking a long, luxurious bath or anything, even if it's not just for hygiene, as long as it's there for the embellishment and enjoyment of the Chag, that's okay. There are some who still hold to a more stringent view, but for Yom Tov, there are many who have that opinion. Again, as we saw,
But
Yom
also
Tov
for
in
Shabbat,
general.
correct? For
Well,
Shabbat also, you can take a shower, no?
That's more, pardon the expression, hotly debated. There are many that hold that a shower on Shabbat is a deliberate attempt to cause more water to be boiled. And since boiling water in general would not be permitted, that would not be allowed. There are some who get around that by turning down the thermostat on their water heater before Shabbat. There are others who explain that the boiling of additional water is not the intention at all, and that, in fact, a person is perfectly happy if the water doesn't reboil until the next day. And so, therefore, any additional heating of extra water is incidental. But most will agree that if your water heater is one of those, what do they call those? We had one in Israel in our apartment. It's like you turn the water heater on when you need it. It's like a switch outside the bathroom or shower.
The timer.
Yeah, exactly. It's on. No, but it's on for a very short time. So like you say, I'm going to have a shower, in 10 minutes, and you switch it on and it heats the water right then and there for your shower. That everybody agrees that's not allowed on Shabbat.
That's not allowed.
Not allowed, because you are definitely deliberately heating water right then and there that is going to be used right then and there for your shower. And that is definitely not allowed on Shabbat. Obviously, also in Israel, people are very fortunate because many people have built-in hot water heaters that are solar up on the roof. And that will add extra hot water just naturally, so you don't have to use any extra energy at all. And most people will agree that those are perfectly fine on Shabbat. Some still say no. Well, because it's not necessarily going to reach boiling temperatures, that it's only reaching hot or warm temperatures. But there are those who disagree because it's Judaism and we can always argue.
So, Rabbi,
yes,
you can heat water as long as you don't heat it to a boiling degree?
Well, on Shabbat, that's the question when it comes to, for example, reheating a very wet food. That are you boiling it or are you merely reheating it? And the usual rule of thumb is whether or not it reaches a temperature that will scald the hand, that it will cause an actual burn. And most people will hold that as long as it's not going to and couldn't do so, meaning the reheating tray would never reach that level of scalding heat, then you are allowed to reheat even liquidy things. Of course, in the modern world, the way we get around most of this issue is by simply either using timers. For example, we have an automatic what's called a kumkum hot water container for making hot drinks, or we use a crock pot, a slow cooker, for stews and things like that. That is just on for the entirety of Shabbat. We plug it in Friday afternoon, and it doesn't come off until Saturday night. So those are easy ways to avoid these issues, because anything that was on before Shabbat can carry on through Shabbat without problem. And one last point of Beit Hillel's, a man may make a fire and warm himself at it. So Beit Hillel wants to make it very clear, definitely we're not cooking here. We're definitely not even doing something that looks like cooking, called heating up water for our feet. we're just making the fire grow. Again, we have to build the fire in a particular way because we transfer the fire rather than strike it initially on Yom Tov. But you are allowed to just make yourself comfortable on Yom Tov in a way that is not permitted on Shabbat. And Shabbat, there's a lot more we have to go through to make sure that we can stay warm in colder climates. But on Yom Tov, Beit Hillel is very much of the opinion that if you are allowed to make the fire at all, which we definitely can for cooking, then you're allowed to use that fire for other things that would be permitted in themselves, meaning like being warm. You still can't use that fire to go out and do some blacksmithing with making melting iron, but you are allowed to just sit down and be warm in front of it. Yes, Aaron.
How come it says make fire though? Because as you said, it's only transfer.
Well, I'm saying make fire because you can literally lay a fire in a hearth, meaning put all the kindling down and all the wood and whatnot, and then bring over the fire from the other source. And that's transferring it to it. But I mean, you are making the fire in an entirely new setting. But I'm also going out of my way to continually reminding people with that phrase, transfer fire, transfer fire, transfer fire, because that's something that people often get caught up on. Most notably for Shabbat candles, when Yom Tov was the day before, that you are allowed to transfer fire to those Shabbat candles, but you're not allowed to strike the match to light those Shabbat candles. That's why you buy those long burning candles and you light them before the holiday begins, so that you have a ready flame source that is stable and reliable to then light the Shabbat candles off of. Rather than using a match.
How come they
so I'm going out of my way to continually put that transfer motif in here because I know that many people are unaware of that particular nuance.
I just thought it was where they put make in the notes because that sounds like creating, not transferring.
Well, and that's why we read the Mishnah together rather than risking drawing our own conclusions, which could be not in keeping with rabbinic understanding. All right, and at 8:03, I think we made pretty good progress despite the starting late, and we will pick up with Mishnah 2:6 come next Wednesday.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Everyone. Thank you. Baruch Tiyeh. Keep